Hi, so I here's my concept map for ways race intersects with class, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality in social relationships and power dynamics. And then one thing that I noticed was that it all came down to history, and then right next to it I wrote Africans, Latins, and then Europeans, and then also should have put Asian cultures as well. But what I noticed is that it all came down from history where African slaves were took to America, and then in America, the light skinned ones were treated differently. They were treated more appropriately. Well, not appropriately, but they were treated with higher class. They were allowed to read and write, and they got easier jobs. And the darker skinned ones, they weren't allowed to read, and they worked outside in harsh conditions. And then when Latins came down below America, well, actually, I should say, when Europeans and Latins started mixing together, they started mixing races and other ethnicities together, and then depending on how light your skin was, you got better power. You had more social class, and the darker skin you were, the lower class you had, and then between those two, that's how the power dynamic kind of started in America too. But I also want to note that I found this is just my own personal take, but I also thought there was some intergenerational trauma as well, especially in America, where the slaves were kept slaves, and then the trauma of the racism, the prejudice, they were passed down from generation to generation to children, and it just keeps getting passed on and passed on. And even too with white folks passed down the prejudice and the discrimination that they did, and then they pass it off as a good thing or a bad thing, and they pass it down to their future generations. And then I also wanted to touch upon intersectionality, and that's actually what my essay's about. And right here I wrote blacks, Latinas, and Latinos, and the Arabs and Asians, and about how their ethnicities and their races and their skin color all co-inspire to society. They are all subjugated to prejudice. Well, one thing I found interesting was about Latinos and Latinas, specifically Latinas. They're more characterized as sexually hyper. They're more characterized as sex objects, or they're more characterized as maids. And with take for example, if they're subjugated to being maids, then they serve as the white people, and or it could also marginalize them, as put down here, where they have less of a chance of being brought into the U.S. or immigrated to the U.S. due to their status as being just called a maid. And then another thing I found interesting was how it actually history creates internal oppression, is what I thought of, where especially in chapter 6 with beauty, where the text discuss beauty, where due to the history and the intergenerational trauma, it can be correlated with internal oppression, where they think that since they are not lighter skin, they are not as beautiful, so they will actually, in some cultures, they do some skin bleaching to look white, to look beautiful, so that women can get a man to marry them, and that a man can have a white woman, and it would be more prestigious for them to have the lighter skin color for both of them. And then I also put down systematic racism. I think I mentioned it before, but I'll say it again. Where there's due to the history and the intersectionality, some races have more advantages in society. They have more access to welfare, health, social communities, and other stuff. But then the other thing I wanted to point out was in chapter 5, where they talk about the show Blackish, where they're actually trying to talk about the issues, where they're actually trying to bring forth their voice about how angry they are, talk about it in a more intellectual way about how it affects other people. And that's where we're down solidarity, where they're more talking about the issues that they face and how it's wrong and what people can learn from. And then as connected to social systematic racism. It also comes down to privilege, and it talked about that in chapter 5 and 6. And chapter 5 and 6, chapter 5 talked about how the controlling image can have a negative effect on some races and ethnicities to where they actually not play in, but we'll take for example black men. In media, they're more portrayed as thugs or gangsters, and then actually they have a really high. A lot of them are actually in prison in real life, and then that's reinstating discrimination and then reinstating the privilege about how America is great, America is moral, America is amazing, even though we have so many problems. White America. And then that actually can relate to stereotyping too, and systematic marginalization. Where take for example um, Arabs are they're more seen as more vulnerable, and especially in foreign affairs, especially in foreign interventions, they're more seen as vulnerable, and that their religion or their ethnicity or the rules that they follow, they're discriminatory, and then that we Americans are supposed to go over there and help them out and save them from that. But that's not always the case. That's just how they live their life. So that's an example of how America, white America, is portrayed as we're the saviors, we're the good people, but we're not actually. We're really really stuck in old times, and we're still racist, and we still struggle with it. And then something I found really important too. Something I found really important, like I mentioned before, like how history played such an important role in today's society, where it just makes me think, if we did not think that light skin was more beautiful, then what would have happened? How would it have changed history? What if we saw darker skin color as more beautiful? How could that have changed history? So I would just be more curious about how, if certain things have not taken place, such as bringing slaves to the Americas, what would have happened in terms of colorism? What would happen in terms of defining race? What would have happened in terms of defining ethnicity? So I'd just be curious about that. And another thing I found important was how it can really influence how ethnicity, gender, sexuality, well, how race intersecting with gender, ethnicity, and sexuality can really shape and form relationships, in social relationships, where people, such as friends, where some people are see as skin color as more of an advantage, or sometimes what I see before too is that people want to be with their own race or ethnicity or sexuality, so they want to be with others just like them, and it really shapes the social circle in a way, because they're more everyone wants to be with each other that they're similar, like, or they agree with, or they share common interests with, such as race, ethnicity, skin color, sexuality, etc. And then it also changes power dynamics too. Changes power dynamics to where I mentioned this before too, but I'll say it again, where it talks about the power dynamics of, let's just say, African Americans. African Americans in America are more prone to poverty. They're more prone to violence. They're more prone to um, inequality, racial inequality, especially in criminal justice. They're very heavily prejudiced against in the criminal justice system, and that's due to the history of how we treated African Americans before, and how we marginalize, well, not marginalize them, but how we systematically approach them to where, and how we portray them as thugs and gangs and robbers and murderers. That changes the power dynamics of the judicial system, specifically black people, and it's very very unfair toward uh, white people that have the same sentencing, or not the same sentencing, the same crime, white people have a less severe punishment than do black people in the judicial system. Sometimes it's for the same crime. And again, with controlling images, that's another thing that I found interesting, and it was in the videos too that I watched. I found it really interesting I never really thought about it before, um how we view race in the media can really affect our points of views about how we see others that are different, that are not white, how we treat others, where we treat different races with different approaches. And then again, I wanted to point out that majority of what I got was in the book, especially with history. History, I got a lot from chapter 6. And then with privilege, we talked about chapter 5 and chapter 6, about how that kind of intermingles in the internal oppression. I got that from chapter 6, specifically talking about beauty and skin bleaching and all that. And then colorism, again, we talked a lot about that in chapter 6 of the book. And then again, it just really, race intersecting with sexuality, gender, and ethnicity, they really, really do influence social relationships and power dynamics, not just in the U.S. We see a lot in the U.S., but also everywhere else in the U.S., such as India, Indonesia, other Asian countries and states, and all that, and Latin America and all that. So it's not just the U.S., it's everywhere else too that we see it. We just always hear in America. And that's it. Thank you.